Hour. I am your host for tonight, Mary Jane Calderon, joining you from my office at Behringer-Crawford Museum. Also joining me by the powers of Zoom is our presenter for the evening, Keith O'Brien, and my assistant for the evening, Heather Cook, at her dorm in Wester, Ohio. So thank you both for being here. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's history museum, that would not be possible without support. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carol Ann and Ralphie Hale Jr. Foundation, and our members. If you're not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. Learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. We would love to hear from our viewers tonight, so if you have a question or comment to share, please type it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and I will be sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. So let's meet tonight's presenter. Keith O'Brien is the New York Times bestselling author of Paradise Falls, Fly Girls, and Outside Shot, a finalist for the ESPN Award for Literary Sportswriting, and an award-winning journalist. O'Brien has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Politico, and his stories have also appeared on National Public Radio and This American Life, and he lives in New Hampshire. So thank you so much for joining us, Keith. Now, before we get started, there is a quiz question tonight. The first respondent to enter a correct answer in the chat on Zoom or Facebook Live wins a Northern Kentucky History Hour prize, and most importantly, bragging rights. So tonight's question is, 4 men who played baseball at Western Hills High School would later go on to be major league managers. Who were they? So go ahead and leave those answers in the chat. And then Keith, if you are ready, we can go ahead and get started.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you, Mary Jane, for that introduction. Thank you to the museum for having me. And thank you to all of you for coming out tonight for this talk. So, I'm born and raised in Cincinnati. Spent my entire childhood there. And so tonight we're going to talk about baseball, gambling, life, Pete Rose. We'll even talk a little bit about where we went to high school, because that's what we do in the greater Cincinnati area. I want to start by saying off the top that, Pete Rose's universe, and it is a universe, is a very strange place. And it's the kind of place where chain reactions happen. It happened during the reporting of this book. It still happens today to me. And, I am a part of that universe now, whether I want to be or not. One thing I learned in reporting this book is that, there is a gravitational pull to Pete Rose, and you can get sucked in by his gravitational force. And once you have been, you're sort of trapped in that universe forever, whether you want to be or not. And it, as I said, it's the kind of place where chain reactions happen. And it happened just even in recent weeks here. Just when the book was coming out this spring, Charlie Hustle, the very first day. It was just a few days after the scandal had broken in Los Angeles, the gambling scandal involving Shohei Ohtani's interpreter, and it seemed at the time perhaps Shohei Ohtani himself. As some of you may remember, Pete Rose kept his silence on this scandal, this gambling scandal, for a few days, and then he couldn't anymore. And he finally interjected himself into it by posting a viral video. And in this viral video, Pete said, I wish I had had an interpreter in the 1970s and 80s. I would have been off scot-free. And, it's a good line. It's a funny line. The video does what it's intended to do. It goes viral. And on the day of my first book event, I'm walking uptown in New York City on the Upper West Side into the bookstore when I get a text message from a man named Tommy Giosa. And Tommy Giosa was a much younger man than Pete Rose and a good friend of his in the 70s and 80s. And he was one of these kind of folks who'd been sucked in by Pete's gravitational pull. And Tommy, in this little window of time between 1977 and 1987, keeps Pete's secrets and places his bets on sports, places his bets on baseball. And so I'm walking into the bookstore and I get the text message from Tommy and he says, have you seen the video? And I said, of course, yes, I've seen the video, Tommy. And he texted back and he said, LOL, I guess Pete forgot that I was his interpreter in the 1970s and 80s. This is the world of Pete Rose. This is the world that I wanted to write about. And this book, my book, Charlie Hustle, is a unique one in several ways. It is the only book that has ever been written that included Pete Rose's participation, even though he did not have editorial control over this book. And it is really one of a rare set of books that doesn't take a side. I'm not here to make a case tonight for Pete Rose. I'm not here to make a case tonight against Pete Rose. What I wanted to do with this book was look at his story through the prism of history, tell that story with granular, on-the-ground reporting, and then let people come to their own conclusions. And, the other thing I wanted to do with this book is open the door to rooms that perhaps we have not seen before. And I wanted to do that in a number of different ways. I wanted to open the door to rooms with my reporting, with interviews, and sometimes even with photographs. And anytime I did open the door to a room that we hadn't seen before, a room that was dark and dusty, that was a room where I wanted to stay and linger and do more reporting. And I thought I'd start tonight with a photograph that I unearthed for this book that really until now had never seen the light of day, that really until now had only existed in shoeboxes and attics on the west side of Cincinnati. I want to start with the photo of Pete Rose's 1956 15U city champion baseball team. Now, I love this photo for lots of reasons. The first is, not every 15-year-old boy looks like his future self, but Pete Rose does. For those of you who have any familiarity at all with Pete Rose, I don't need to point out for you where he is in this photograph. He is, of course, in the second row there in the crew cut, two from the right. The other thing I love about this photo is that, he is not nearly the best player on this team. Again, this is a team of 15-year-olds, all who live within a 2 or 3 mile radius of each other on the west side of Cincinnati. And Pete is not the best player on this team. In fact, he was never the best player on his own baseball teams of his youth. The best player on this team is actually standing just over Pete Rose's shoulder. That man, a young man there with the blonde crew cut, was a boy named Art Luby. And Art Luby was a left-handed pitcher. And in 1956, the spring, summer, and fall of 56, every time that Art Luby pitched, they won, including in that city championship game late that August. And so if you had shown this photo to anyone on the West Side in 1956 or 57 or 58 and said, who in this photograph is going to go on to become an iconic American baseball player, everybody would have pointed to Art Luby there in the top row. But it doesn't work out that way. It isn't Art who's going to make any headlines. It's the boy sitting just beneath him. And the last thing I love about this photo is just Pete Rose's size in this photo. He looks as if he could be some of these kids' little brother or the bat boy on this team. He is significantly smaller than the other boys on this team. And so, all of those things about this photo, I think, make it a powerful one. And it is part of the book because I think it says so much. It certainly said a lot to me. But of course, despite his lack of size and his lack of talent, Pete Rose, will make it, and he will do so in large part because of his father, Harry Francis Rose. Harry Francis on the west side of Cincinnati was better known as Big Pete, and he was the original star athlete in the Rose family. He was primarily a football star on the west side in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Pete, Big Pete, drills into his son, Little Pete, that he has to hustle, that he has to work hard, and Big Pete also brings him to all of his football games there on the west side in the 1940s and 50s. Another photo I unearthed for the book was this one here. It's a photo of Big Pete's 1947 West Side football team, a team of semi-pro players, who all had day jobs and then played hard on the weekends. Big Pete is all the way over there on the right, and Little Pete is right there in the middle. You can get a better look at them here. And, so Big Pete hammers into his son that he has to work hard, that he has to hustle. He brings him to those games. And Little Pete doesn't rebel against his father's dreams, wishes, and preachings. Indeed, he does the opposite. Little Pete really does want to please his father and want to be the star athlete that his father wants him to be. And I don't think I'm going to ruin this book for you, Charlie Hustle, by telling you that Pete Rose, of course, will make it. He will. But he'll make it through a string of almost miraculous lucky breaks. Really, when you look back at Pete Rose's story, as I did in this book and in my research, you see that it's really lucky break after lucky break in the first half of his life, the first half of his career, that leads him to the mountaintop of American life. And one of those lucky breaks happens in the spring of 1963 with this man here. Some of you diehard baseball fans may recognize him. This is Fred Hutchinson. Fred Hutchinson was the manager of the Cincinnati Reds in the 1960s. And in the spring of 1963, Pete Rose has been playing in the minor leagues for 3 years. He's had one okay season in the minors and then two pretty great ones. But he's only played at A-ball and Double-A. And so going into spring training in 1963, everyone expects that Pete Rose will be assigned to Triple-A San Diego. He most likely needs one more year of seasoning and experience before perhaps coming to the major leagues. He also is just objectively the fourth best second baseman on the depth chart. There's an entrenched second baseman with the big club in Cincinnati. That's Don Blasingame. And then there are two minor leaguers in front of him. One of those men you will remember, any Reds fan will anyway. That man's name was Tommy Helms, who was going to be going to Triple-A San Diego in the spring of 1963. And the other one was a guy named Bobby Klaus, who had already played a year at Triple-A. So Pete Rose is fourth on the depth chart, seems destined for Triple-A in 63, but something happens that spring training that will happen to Pete many times over the course of his career. Fred Hutchinson sees something in Pete Rose that he likes about himself. This notion of hustle and tenacity. Fred Hutchinson had been himself a major leaguer, a pitcher, and he had succeeded on that grit and tenacity. And he sees that in Pete. He likes that. And in fact, I would submit that this is not just something that Fred Hutchinson liked in Pete Rose. It's something that many people will like in Pete Rose. This notion of hustle that if you work hard, if you try hard, if you hustle, you can do anything. That is the American bedtime story. And so Fred sees it in Pete Rose, and he begins to play him at spring training more and more in the spring of '63. And finally, on a Sunday, March 17th, 1963, Pete is starting against the New York Yankees. And this is a big deal, this game. It's a sellout at Old Al Lopez Field in Tampa, Florida. It's going to be televised back in Cincinnati. Pete Rose's father is going to be there sitting in the bleachers. And something will happen that day that will change the course of Pete Rose's life. Pete Rose plays that day with the fury that we will come to know him for later. He leads off the game by getting on base. He scampers all the way around the bases, scores the first run of the game, sliding headfirst into home. He later breaks up a double play, sliding hard into second base. And then he leads off the fifth inning by dropping down a bunt for a hit in a practice game, in a scrimmage at spring training. And it's sort of this moment that's the breaking point for two men in the Yankees dugout. One of them is Mickey Mantle, and the other one is his Hall of Fame teammate, Whitey Ford, the pitcher. And Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford are completely different from Pete Rose. These are two men who have been touched by the hand of God with innate baseball talent. And they're standing on the steps of the dugout now and almost laughing at Pete Rose, laughing at how hard he is playing. And what they will say that day isn't exactly clear. In the days ahead, some newspapers will report that they called him Henry Hustle. Other newspapers will say that Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford called him the Charlie Hustler. And it's only in the days after that, in the newspapers, that the press, the baseball writers, settle on a story that they like. And they say that Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford called him Charlie Hustle. And you know, this name is not intended to be a compliment. But Pete Rose does something with it that spring that he will do many times over the course of his life, and that I would say he's still doing to some extent today. He will rebrand this moment. And when Pete Rose makes the big club that spring, and when he becomes the starting opening day second baseman, and when he travels to town for the very first time, flying on planes to Chicago and New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco, Pete Rose will meet sports writers there and tell them the story of the day that Mickey Mantle called him Charlie Hustle because he liked the way that Pete played. He rebrands it. And I do think that this name, even just this name, is a reason why people will gravitate to Pete Rose. And by 1978, Pete Rose is an American icon. Again, whether you like him or not today, whether you support him or not today, or whether you ever did, he was an American icon by the late 1970s. Not just one of our best baseball players, but one of our most famous Americans. And in the summer of '78, his fame will spawn headlines like this one here. Pete for president, a real headline from the summer of '78, at a time when Jimmy Carter's approval ratings were really sagging in the White House. And it wasn't as absurd a notion as it might sound today. Pete Rose indeed had visited the Oval Office already and would visit it yet again, at least one more time. Pete Rose would meet both Presidents Carter and Reagan. And he would do this because, again, he was iconic. And one thing I learned going back and telling this story is that you simply cannot write the story of baseball in the 20th century without Pete Rose. He is there in the middle of significant moments in baseball history again and again and again in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He is, of course, there on the Big Red Machine teams of the 1970s, the teams that will win back-to-back World Series titles in 1975 and 76. And our baseball historians would all agree, one of the best baseball teams ever assembled. He is there, of course, in 1978 during the 44-game hit streak that will captivate America that summer. Pete Rose would be devastated, crushed when the streak ends at 44 games because it's 12 shy of the record. But I do think it's important to point out that this streak, 44, is the longest hit streak we have seen in Major League Baseball since 1941, 82 years, 83 years. And this record seems unlikely to fall anytime soon. And then, of course, he is there in September 1985 when he sets the all-time hit record. And I believe that if you were alive and you were watching in 1985 on this warm September night, you remember exactly where you were. I remember exactly where I was. I was in my parents' house on the east side of Cincinnati. I was standing in front of the television with my father because no one was sitting in this moment. And, you know, I've learned as a journalist to never say never, but it does seem to me as if this particular record, the all-time hit record, will never fall. You know, when we began this baseball season just a few months ago or weeks ago now, the active all-time hit leader is a player that some of you may know. His name is Freddie Freeman. Freddie Freeman is the first baseman for the Los Angeles Dodgers. He's of late, he's been a great player, an all-star player. If Freddie Freeman continues to have for the next 5 or 6 years the kind of season he's had for the last 3 or 4, Freddie Freeman might be a future Hall of Famer. But I've done the math on Freddie Freeman. He starts this season, again, as the active hit leader all time in baseball with 2,115 hits. That's almost exactly half of Pete Rose's total of 4,256. Freddie Freeman is 34 years old. And so even if he averages 190 hits a year, an absurd total over the next decade, Freddie Freeman will still come up short. He will not pass Pete Rose. So Pete Rose ascends to the mountaintop of American life. But even while he's doing it, even while it's happening, even while we're cheering and inviting him into the White House and suggesting that he should run for president, he is already making decisions off the field that will lead to his inevitable doom. He is having affairs with young women in at least 2 states, including this woman here, Terry Rubio, a woman in her early 20s who has a long affair with Pete Rose in the mid-1970s and ultimately has a child with him, a secret child in 1978 that will lead to a paternity suit against him filed just before the 1979 season. This paternity suit and these decisions off the field will lead to a very public divorce in Cincinnati from his first wife, Carolyn Rose. Again, if you were alive in the 1970s and in Cincinnati, you know Carolyn Rose was just as popular as Pete Rose, if not more so. She was a loud and extroverted personality and presence at all of the Reds games. And this divorce in late 1979 will force people on the West Side to make difficult decisions, the kind of decisions we have to make when our friends get divorced. People on the West Side will have to decide, will they remain friends with Carolyn, or will they remain friends with Pete? While all of this is happening, Pete Rose is already gambling in the shadows with bookies. Rumors of his gambling are reaching not just the Reds front office, but the front office of Major League Baseball. This is a full decade, of course, before he is ultimately banned for life for gambling on baseball, gambling on his own games, betting on his team to win. So this, to me, is far more than a baseball story. This is an epic human story of almost Greek tragedy proportions. And that is indeed how I began to think about this story. I do see it as a Greek tragedy that just happened to play out in and around an American baseball field. And so, you know, I wanted to tell it from the inside. I wanted to get intimate access. I wanted to get to Pete Rose, even if I could. And so what do? Well, I come back to Cincinnati and I begin my reporting there, talking to people who everyone in Cincinnati knows are Pete Rose's pals. You know, I began my interviews there, talking to them. It was through those interviews and relationships I built with those people that I got an introduction to Pete Rose and was told to call him on a Friday in September 2021. And when I called Pete Rose on that day, he was ready to talk. He was ready to go. And suddenly I was in. I conducted 27 hours of interviews with Pete Rose, both on the phone and in person here at his favorite diner in Las Vegas, where he lives today. I spent a couple days with Pete Rose on the road at events, including this one here at the Hard Rock Casino in downtown Cincinnati, where Pete Rose was hired to come in to place the first bet at the blackjack table, a bet, of course, that he will win because the deck has been stacked. And I was there with him at autograph shows. You know, Pete Rose is a pretty regular presence at autograph shows across America. And for this, you know, he's gotten a bit of criticism. And in general, I would say that I think Pete Rose deserves all the criticism that he gets. But on this case, I would say no. Many of the athletes that you like, that you cheered for, that you respect, also make a good living on the autograph circuit. And many of these men, your favorite players, have a lot of rules about what they will or won't sign. They will only sign their jersey or baseballs. They will not sign bats or their baseball cards or novelty items. They will not take photographs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Pete Rose has no rules. He will sign just about anything. I've seen him sign it all. I've even seen him sign body parts here. This was at an autograph show in Cincinnati in December 2021. I spotted this woman in line several people deep before she got to Pete Rose's table. I noticed her because she was hyperventilating and almost already crying about the prospect of meeting Pete Rose. And so I parked myself next to her as she went through the line and ultimately asked Pete to sign her arm. This woman said that her father's favorite player had been Pete Rose. Her father had recently died. And she told me that she was leaving the autograph show to go have Pete's autograph tattooed right there on her arm. I did wonder what happened to Sarah, this woman. I did not know until about a month ago when I was back in Cincinnati during the launch of my book. And I met her once again, this time at a book event. And I can tell you that she did follow through on her promise. She did have Pete Rose's name tattooed right there on her arm. So I'm in. I've got access to Pete Rose. We're talking. I'm doing the interviews. He's answering questions. And then suddenly, as quickly as I am in, I was out. And he did stop returning my calls. I don't know why. We did not have a falling out. All I can tell you is that I was pushing Pete. I was pushing him to talk about things that he hasn't talked about before. And all I can speculate is that I pushed him as far as he was willing to go. But this book was never going to be just about Pete Rose or built just on interviews with Pete Rose. When I started, I wasn't even sure I would get access to Pete Rose. And so with the time I have left, I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about some of the other folks I interviewed, and then I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. One important person that I wanted to build out for this book was a man there from Cincinnati, a man named Alphonse Esselman. Alphonse Esselman, or Al Esselman, was Pete Rose's first bookie in Cincinnati. And based on my reporting, Pete Rose is placing bets with Al by at least the early 1970s, if not sooner. As you can see from the headlines here, Al Esselman wasn't just from the west side of Cincinnati, although that was where he lived and that was how Pete Rose knew him. For a few years in the 1960s, Al Esselman owned a bar in Newport called the High Lie Club that was a front for his gambling activities. And so I want to build out Al Esselman's story because this is where it starts for Pete Rose, betting with bookies. And I couldn't interview Al because he's been dead for a number of years. So I began to talk to people on the west side about Al Esselman. This was a guy who was an upstanding citizen, a member of the Western Hills Country Club. His wife played in the ladies' league there. His children went to Catholic schools. And I tried to talk to his children too, and ultimately did speak to one, his oldest daughter, a woman named Jackie Esselman Fry. I reached Jackie Esselman Fry by phone in early 2022. I explained who I was and what I was doing. And she asked that question that we asked ourselves in the greater Cincinnati area. Jackie asked me, where'd you go to high school? So I told her I went to St. Xavier High School. She asked me where I grew up. I told her Anderson Township. She said, well, I lived in Anderson Township for decades. And she explained that she lived on Blair House. And I said, I lived on Deer Haven. And these two streets are like in the same neighborhood. And now my mind is racing and I'm thinking, Jackie Esselman Fry on Blair House. I said, do you have a son named David Fry? And she said, yeah, that's my oldest son. And I said, Mrs. Fry, this is Keith O'Brien. You took me to the monster truck pool at the Cincinnati Coliseum in 1983. I went to school at Immaculate Heart of Mary with your son, David. And now I was in with Jackie Esselman Fry and able to build out in the book Al Esselman as a character, as a protagonist. And he does matter, Al Esselman, because time and again, Al Esselman will have an opportunity to make life easier on himself by telling federal investigators who will arrest him multiple times about his famous client, Pete Rose. But he will not do that. And I know that for a fact because I have seen Al Esselman's FBI file. He says nothing about Pete Rose. Unlike other bookies who will come later, Al Esselman keeps his silence. Another Cincinnati connection that helped with this book was my mother. That's my mom right there. That's me. That's December 2021, the waning days of the COVID times. We're wearing our masks because we're in a pharmacy. My mother is a nurse, and she was giving shots at that time, the COVID shots. And I took this photograph on this day. because my mom had given me my COVID shot, and that felt like something notable. And you know, one thing to know about my mom is that she's like the grandma assassin. She will find out everything about you in 3 minutes or less. And a few weeks after this photograph, my mom was giving a shot to a different patient. And this man's name was Dave. My mom starts asking Dave questions about who he is and what he does. Dave explains that he's a high school baseball coach. Actually, he says he's really been in baseball, you know, his whole life. And my mom says, well, I'm writing a book about baseball and Pete Rose. And Dave turns to her and says, well, I think your son might be interested in speaking to me because that man, Dave, was Dave Collins of the Cincinnati Reds. And you can see from Dave's career log here that he plays 16 years in Major League Baseball, 16, and is traded to the Reds in 1978. And this matters because 1978 is that year when Pete Rose will go on that 44-game hit streak. And when he does, Dave Collins is right there in the dugout. He's a young player, and he is watching and listening. He wants to learn from Pete Rose and Johnny Bench and other star players on the Cincinnati Reds. And Dave Collins remembers something from the 78 season. He remembers a game sometime early in that season when Pete Rose was missing around the batting cage. And this is notable because Pete Rose loved the batting cage. He probably loved it more than the game itself. He loved swinging, he loved hitting, he loved the banter and the camaraderie. And so it was weird that Pete Rose wasn't there. So Dave Collins begins asking around, where's Pete? And the story around the cage that day, that I later corroborated from other sources, is that Pete Rose was upstairs in the office of Reds president Dick Wagner for a meeting with at least one official from Major League Baseball. And the conversation that day was about gambling and bookies and debts. This is 1978, 11 years before the rest of us will come to know anything about Pete Rose's gambling problem or the depths of it. This meeting, this secret meeting that Dave Collins and others are aware of, makes no headlines, leads to no ramifications, no investigation at all. But one person in 1978 would have known what was happening in the shadows, and that man was Tommy Giosa, the person I mentioned at the outset, Pete's so-called interpreter from the 1970s and 80s, the guy who was placing Pete's bets with bookies, keeping his secrets. This is Tommy Giosa's high school senior baseball photograph in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And, you know, just to show you how difficult it is to become Pete Rose, in his senior season right here, Tommy Giosa bats over 500, but he receives no offers from minor league teams, no offers from big-time colleges. Tommy Giosa has no choice but to go play baseball at a nearby community college in Brockton, Massachusetts. And nothing great really happens for Tommy in Brockton, except for one thing. For 2 seasons, in February and March, the Brockton team travels to Tampa, Florida to play in a preseason community college baseball tournament at Old Al Lopez Field, the home of the Cincinnati Reds. And Tommy Giosa stays in the same hotel as Pete Rose. And what happens to Tommy there? He gets sucked into that gravitational pull, like I mentioned, and is soon no longer playing baseball, but instead is willing to do anything for Pete Rose. He does his dry cleaning, he washes his cars, and does keep his secrets, hide his girlfriends, place his bets on sports, place his bets on baseball. And Tommy is willing to do this because Pete has given him something too. He's welcomed him into a world that Tommy never imagined he would ever see. Pete Rose gets Tommy tryouts with the Blue Jays, the Orioles, and indeed gets him a spot on the University of Cincinnati baseball team in 1980 that leads to this headline here in the Cincinnati Enquirer. Cincinnati Enquirer is now referring to Tommy Giosa as Charlie Hustle. He is, they say, the second coming of Pete Rose. But it doesn't work out like that for Tommy. He will not last at the University of Cincinnati. He will not make it on the Blue Jays or the Orioles or the Phillies or any other major league team. And soon he is just doing Pete's bidding in the shadows. And Tommy will ultimately make a terrible mistake in 1989 as the walls begin to close around Pete Rose. Tommy will refuse to cooperate with Major League Baseball when they come calling. He will refuse to cooperate with this man here, John Dowd, the man who Major League Baseball has hired to unravel Pete Rose's lies. And for this, ultimately, Tommy Giosa, will pay a very awful price. And finally, there is one last person I wanted to mention tonight. One last person who does, just like Tommy, get sucked in by Pete's gravitational pull. One thing I found in writing this book is that many people, including famous ones at times, are often defined by one moment, one night, one game, one play, one wager, one argument with Pete Rose. And one of those people was the catcher for the Cleveland Indians, Ray Fosse. Any one of you who is a baseball fan will know the general parameters of the Ray Fosse story. He was, in 1970, the best young catcher in the American League. He was the Johnny Bench of the American League. Indeed, the Indians a few years earlier had a chance to draft Johnny Bench, but instead, in that same draft, drafted Ray Fosse instead. And in the spring of 1970, in summer of 1970, Ray Fosse is finally having the year that the Indians expected of him. He enters the All-Star game in 1970, having hit 16 home runs before the break. He is on pace to hit more than 30. And anyone who knows anything about baseball knows that a catcher who can hit 30 home runs a year and do that for even 8 or 9 years is a Hall of Famer. So this game is going to be a big game for Ray Fosse. And it would have been a big game were it not even for the way it ends with Rose and Fosse colliding at home plate. Entering that 1970 All-Star game, it was a game that included 24 future Hall of Famers. It was going to be played in Riverfront Stadium, a brand new stadium that had been only open for 2 weeks. The stadium had been sold out for the entire spring. At one point that spring, the fuses blew at the new stadium, at the call center, overwhelmed with people trying to get tickets. That night on NBC, 50 million people will be watching. 50 million watching a meaningless midseason exhibition game. Mickey Mantle will be working in the broadcast booth. The man who once gave Pete Rose his nickname is now a broadcaster. Pete's father is sitting behind home plate, not far from Richard Nixon, who will throw out the first pitch in that game, sitting next to the commissioner of baseball, Bowie Kuhn. That's Bowie who's pointing there. We can all sort of imagine a president coming in to throw out the first pitch. What we can't imagine is that Nixon stays for the entire night. Nixon stays while this game goes into extra innings and goes into the 12th inning. A 4-4 game in the bottom of the 12th, when Pete Rose will come to the plate and do what Pete Rose does. He gets a hit. And then another man behind him gets a hit. And then another man behind him gets a hit too, leading to a play at the plate that will change everything for both men. One for the good and one for the ill. And, I started with the photo tonight. I'll end with a photo. Anyone who's a baseball fan or even a Cincinnatian has probably seen photos of the Ray Fosse-Pete Rose collision that ends this All-Star game. And there is a famous one. The most famous photograph, Pete is slamming into Ray. The two men are colliding. Ray Fosse's glove is coming dislodged from his body. And I could have licensed that photo, but I chose to license this photo instead. This photo was probably taken about 1 second or 2 seconds after the famous one. And what I love about it is this is the moment where it's all changed. Ray Fosse injures his shoulder in the collision and will never be the same again. He will never hit more than 10 home runs in a single season and will only hit 2 more that year. And Pete Rose is also forever altered. This, to me, is the moment when Pete Rose becomes Charlie Hustle. Most people in the 1960s had never seen him play. That night, we will. 50 million people will. And this moment really does gild the mythology of the Charlie Hustle persona. And I want to thank you for listening. And I'd be happy to take any questions at all about my reporting, about the story, about Pete Rose.
Wow, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Keith. I know that we do have some comments and questions, but first let's go ahead and answer that trivia question. Heather, do you want to go ahead and repeat that question and give the answer, and we can announce who won?
So the question was, 4 men who played baseball at Western Hills High School would later go on to be major league managers, and who were they? And so the answer to that was Pete Rose, Don Zimmer, Jim Fry, and Russ Nixon. And we did have people on both Zoom and Facebook Live get that correct. And that was Larry Spalding and Will Turwart.
Congratulations. Good job, gentlemen. Okay, and what about our questions? Let's see. Do we want to start with Zoom?
Sure.
Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the questions we had was, do you think he will ever, Pete Rose will ever be allowed to be inducted into the Hall of Fame again?
Well, right. So he's never been inducted into the Hall of Fame. So there's no again just yet. I go back and forth on this. I mean, on the one hand, prevailing wisdom is that after he's dead and gone, they'll finally let him in. On the other hand, I do wonder who will be advocating for Pete Rose after he is dead and gone. And so I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know. It is truly speculation. What I can say for sure is that there's just no way that they're going to change the rules, reinstate him, do anything, or even put him on the ballot to be admitted into the Hall of Fame while he's still alive.
Okay, I'm interested more in your investigative work that you've done to find out some of this stuff. And we had a question on Facebook from Will that also asked, how did you find out who Pete Rose gambled with in the early days? So how did you do that kind of investigative work?
So, I will say, even though Pete Rose did ultimately stop speaking to me for this book, he did talk to me about things that he had not talked about before. And he did go places that he had not gone before. And so, Pete Rose did talk to me about Al Esselman, and then did help open doors to me on the West Side to speak to others who knew of Pete's gambling with Al Esselman. And so that was crucial. I did, as I said before, 27 hours of recorded interviews with Pete Rose. I did, over 150 hours of interviews with others. I tried to interview anyone who crossed paths with Pete in any significant way in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And specifically, I did try to speak with people who knew of his gambling on sports, or indeed had witnessed it, or even aided and abetted it. And ultimately did speak to 3 different men who placed Pete's bets on baseball.
Okay, Will also added that Hal McCoy said it was the best book ever written about Pete Rose. He wants to know, what made you write this book?
Well, that's high praise from Hal McCoy, the longtime writer for the Dayton Daily News, one of many sports writers and media members who I did interview who actually covered Pete. There were really a couple reasons why I wanted to write this book. As a Cincinnatian, I have always felt that all too often writers have looked at Pete Rose's story through the prism of baseball. And I want to be clear, there's a lot of baseball in my book. I think one reason why I wanted to write it is that we have forgotten why we ever cared about Pete Rose in the first place. And so I wanted to go back and tell the story of that baseball glory. And there is baseball glory. But for me, this was never the story of a baseball player. I always looked at it as the story of a man. And when you start to look at it that way, I think it just gets a lot more interesting. I saw this as a story of an ordinary man from an ordinary working class neighborhood on the west side of Cincinnati, a man of ordinary talent and athleticism who by rights never should have made it. I think today Pete Rose doesn't make it. And then of course gets all the way to the mountaintop and then loses it all through his own choices, his own decisions, his own addictions. That is just a compelling human story. And I felt that if I could get access and tell that and with intimate details in a human way, that it would be a story worth reading.
We're getting a lot of praise about your presentation and about your book. What is the name of your book again? I want to go ahead and get that out there. So in case anybody wants to buy your book, which I'm sure they do, how can they do that?
Thank you, Mary Jane. Yeah, it's called Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. And you can purchase Charlie Hustle wherever they sell books. I will say I've had some events there in Cincinnati and left behind signed books at Joseph Beth and in Rookwood in Cincinnati, and also signed copies at the Reds Hall of Fame downtown.
Perfect. We also have a question from Tim on Zoom that asked, is there anyone that you could not interview due to whatever circumstance it may be?
Well, yeah, sure. So obviously some people were not around. I would have loved, of course, to have interviewed Bart Giamatti, the commissioner of baseball, during the 1989 scandal and investigation. I could not. Bart Giamatti dies, young, dies within days of the investigation ending. So there were many people like that who I just missed. Joe Morgan, certainly another. Joe Morgan, the Hall of Fame teammate and one of Pete Rose's good friends, dies in 2020, about a year and a half before I started my reporting. But there were people who were alive who also wouldn't speak to me. And one of them was his teammate, Johnny Bench. Johnny, I was sort of informed through back channels, is done talking about Pete Rose. Those two have had a sort of fraught relationship over the decades. And so it would have been great, of course, to speak with Johnny about these years, these memories, these scenes, Pete Rose, but I couldn't. But I will say, I mentioned Dave Collins before. One thing I learned in the reporting of the book is that while everybody, of course, wants to speak to the famous people and the Hall of Famers, it's oftentimes the other guys who have the better stories. The guys at the end of the bench, the reliever who only pitched every third day, the rookie who only hung around for 2 seasons. They were there too. They were listening and watching. And some of my best interviews for the book were not indeed with the biggest names.
You might have another one to interview. Larry says he has a very good friend who played football with Pete Rose at Western Hills. He always said Pete was a better football player than a baseball player. He said, if you'd like to touch base with my friend, he lives in Newtown and is quite a storyteller.
Please reach out to me through my website. I'd be happy to try to connect with him. My website is keithob.com, and there's a little tab there to send emails that come straight to me. I'd be happy to try to connect with him. You should definitely get him the book, though.
We also have another question asking if Pete himself attributes his work ethic to his father. He said they didn't know that about his family, and was also asking like who his mother was.
Yeah, so his mother is also featured in the book, of course. Her name was Laverne Blowbaum, was her maiden name. And Laverne Blowbaum came herself from a very athletic family. Her brother, Buddy Blowbaum, was a minor league player briefly, and a bird dog scout in southwestern Ohio. And was really the reason why Pete Rose ever got a chance to even try out for the Cincinnati Reds. But Pete worshipped his father, Big Pete, and still does to this day, even though his father has been dead for 54 years.
So we've also got Patricia added that she's made a pencil sketch of Pete in 1965 that he's autographed. She wonders what the autograph may be worth.
I don't know. So maybe you need to call those vintage antique television shows or everything about the house and see what you think they can get for it for you.
I love hearing local stories. I love hearing people that have, met, because there was also Tammy said in 1985, she was in the third row on the floor of a Tina Turner concert at the Coliseum in Cincinnati. Pete and Carolyn Rose were seated in the same row. She says Pete wore a shiny sharkskin suit and Carolyn's hairdo was Texas high on her head. It was almost surreal. 2 iconic individuals in such close proximity. She
Amazing.
said she met him in Vegas as well, and he signed his number 4192 hit photo for her. He will always be her Charlie Hustle.
We also had another question asking if you collaborated with John Arardi, who also wrote extensively about Pete Rose.
No, I did not. I did not collaborate with anyone, but of course, I'm well aware of John Arardi and his work as a longtime reporter in Cincinnati.
Okay, we'll wrap up with one more question. Will has another one. He wants to know what your next book is going to be.
Well, I've got a handful of ideas that are sort of moving down parallel tracks right now, and not sure which one yet is going to sort of come to fruition. One thing I've learned about doing this kind of work after writing a number of books now is just that the research you do up front, even before you know what you have, is often the most critical research. Doing this, once you've committed to doing a book, it's 2, 3, maybe more years of your life. So I really try to make sure that whatever I'm doing next is something that's going to be worth that kind of time and something that people are going to want to read. I mean, ultimately, I want to tell stories that people want to read.
Well, thank you so much for such an excellent presentation. Thank you again to all of the sponsors and supporters of BCM. Until next time, take care, everyone, and good night. Thank you so much, Keith.
Thank you.